So tonight our guest speaker will be Dave Redell. And Dave has been with us ever since I think I was there. Dave, how long have you been with Canando?
I think about 18 years.
Wow, wonderful.
It was a little after 2000, about 2001, 2002.
Thank you, Dave. And he's been one of our officers. I think you served as president or VP or all of the above, something like that, and has done a lot.
Member of the board, all that stuff.
Yeah. So thanks, Dave, for all you contribute to Canando. And will there be a title for your talk tonight?
Yeah, my talk tonight it's about Zen and science.
Zen and science, wonderful. All right, all right. Welcome, Dave.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Okay, so tonight I want to talk a little about and share some thoughts about Zen and science. When Les asked me to give this talk, I was thinking about some sort of more limited topics, something a little smaller. But I thought about Vanessa's talk 2 months ago, where she dealt in a very intimate way with the great matter of birth and death. And I realized that I was avoiding the topic I really wanted to discuss. I was kind of shying away from it. But Vanessa set a pretty high bar, so I don't expect to convey the same level of heart and intimacy in discussing my topic tonight as she did with the great matter of birth and death, but I'll try not to be too dry and long-winded, even though those of you who know me know I have a certain tendency to be dry and long-winded. But I feel very passionate about this topic, and I hope that comes across at least to some extent. So it's the summer of 1967. I've just graduated from college. The Beatles have just released Sgt. Pepper, and I'm staying in Berkeley for the summer, working as a computer programmer. 1967, it's the summer of love. And my friends and I in Berkeley are all dressing in our funny clothes and going to rock concerts, the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane, and frankly, smoking dope and dropping acid and attending talks by Alan Watts and the Maharishi and doing all that good hippie stuff. And we're also haunting a little bookstore right down on Telegraph Avenue called Shambhala. Now, I, at this point, already consider myself a hardcore scientist, but I have a feeling that there may be something in this little bookstore that I'm missing, something that I need. So I keep going back and browsing. There are books on Krishnamurti and transcendental meditation and Hinduism, shamanism, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And each time I pick one of these up and skim through, I eventually come across something that strikes me as basically anti-scientific mumbo jumbo. And I'm not very tolerant of that. There's some that I don't even bother picking up, like tarot and astral projection. Oh, and there was one book that really endeared me with its title. It was entitled Practical Egyptian Magic. I love that title. So, but I didn't read that one. But I did notice in passing a little volume called Zen Flesh, Zen Bones. Maybe I should look into that one. But then it turned out that I actually went to a talk that was given by Paul Reps, who was the author of Zen Flesh, Zen Bones. So I go and I buy my first Zen book, and it seems pretty cool. There's an occasional mention of stuff like reincarnation. Those of you who know, for example, the story of Hayakujo and the fox will remember that reincarnation sort of snuck in there. But on the whole, I like it. It doesn't really strike me as being laden with too much mumbo jumbo. Over the years, I keep reading about Zen, but for actual practice, I started actually with yoga. The first yoga group I joined, they did hatha and meditation, and increasingly, as time goes on, more and more mumbo jumbo. And so I eventually drop out. The second yoga group I joined has hatha and nothing else. So there's no mumbo jumbo, but there's no meditation either, and I miss that. Eventually, after many years, I end up at Canando and I find meditation with no mumbo jumbo. Boy, that works for me. So how does this Zen stuff fit together with the science that I love so much? everybody knows that at least in our Western civilization, religion and science seem to have been in a death struggle for about the last 400 years. So why does this combination feel so right to me? I mean, the history of religion and science in the West has some pretty dark sides to it. You know, a very long history. It goes back to at least the late 1500s in Europe, where science was basically treated as a form of heresy, just like, you know, Islam or Hinduism. It's heresy. You can be, you know, Galileo was famously arrested for saying that the Earth went around the sun instead of vice versa. And Giordano Bruno, a few years before that, was actually burned at the stake for saying stuff like that. There were many other people who were imprisoned and even killed just in Catholic Europe and elsewhere in the world. That same kind of opposition between religion and science happened. And more recently then, science has really been pushing back. There's been an active opposition to religion coming from the scientific side. You know, I've got some books with titles like Eternal Hostility, God is Not Great, The God Delusion, Why God Won't Go Away. There seems to be, you know, a sort of perpetual conflict between science and religion. So what's going on there? There's this conflict of belief systems. So why does this happen? Well, first, why do people really need and want belief systems in the first place? Why do people get into belief systems? Well, we have this urge. We don't, I guess, know quite where it comes from, but there's this urge to ask these deep questions. You know, who are we? Where did we come from? What is this place, this world, this universe? Where did it come from? What are we doing here? How should we behave in this world? The big ticket item that's often cited as a main reason for people seeking belief systems is mortality. What happens to us after we die? What's the purpose of life? Is there a plan and meaning to it all? Big, heavy duty questions. So what are the belief systems that crop up to try to address these questions, right? Well, first and foremost, I would say a belief system is a collection of a whole lot of authoritative answers to these big questions. Authoritative answers, and these authoritative answers are delivered by very special authorities. Basically, it's tend to be a priesthood or sacred texts recording the sayings of the priesthood. And because these answers are authoritative and are delivered by these privileged authorities, they're to be taken on faith without question. You probably are all familiar with what Jesus said about Thomas, right? That blessed are those who have believed without having to see any evidence. So you accept these things without evidence, without question, without doubt. And then based on accepting this belief system, then that tells you what action to take. And typically one of the things that the belief system says is that you should continue believing this belief system and reject all other belief systems. And of course, these belief systems tend to get all sorts of other social entanglements, political, tribal, and so forth. I mean, Galileo wasn't really imprisoned for saying that, isn't it interesting that the sun doesn't go around the earth? He was questioning not just some sort of astronomical issue, but he was questioning the authority of the church and the priesthood. And that's really what got him in trouble. It was more political than anything else. Okay, so belief systems. So for me personally, it wasn't much of an issue until I was about 13. And I went to a bar mitzvah. A friend of mine had his bar mitzvah. And I was just blown away by the way that these people related to their temple. I mean, they really took this stuff seriously. They had a lot of faith in what they were doing. And it really seemed to address the sort of teenage existential angst that I was starting to feel as a young teenager. And it wasn't too long after that I let a friend talk me into joining the Christian Youth Fellowship at his church, very sort of fundamentalist church. Much to the horror of my parents, who were very liberal Protestants. But eventually, I bailed on that. And that was really the first instance of my strong negative reaction to sort of dogma mumbo jumbo. But it was also the first taste of that yearning that later drove me to hang out at Shambhala looking for answers. By the way, if you're interested in pursuing this whole question of belief systems and what are they and why do people want them, I'd recommend a very good book by Michael Shermer. It's called The Believing Brain. And it's a really excellent book, and it really dives into the whole question of what is belief and why do we do it. But anyway, I want to come back later and re-examine this whole definition of belief systems and so forth with respect to science and Zen. But first, just consider the possible outcomes of the kind of battle between belief systems that I've outlined so far. Okay, how do these conflicts turn out? Well, one thing, of course, is just perpetual warfare. Both sides are dug in, they both persist. There's a population of potential believers, and it's split in varying degrees between the different belief systems about what to believe. And there are even a few people who try to sort of accept multiple belief systems by just repressing the contradictions between them and ignoring that. So you can have this perpetual ongoing warfare, or the warfare might be resolved. One side might actually win. I mean, all the believers might vote with their feet. You hear a lot of sadness now about religious people saying, oh, the church is being abandoned. And I was really struck last year when I was in Europe and Scandinavia about the extent to which they're really much more, they've freed themselves from their previous dogmatic attachments, and they have a much more secular society, much more so than in the United States now. So you can have perpetual warfare, or you could have resolved warfare where one side wins, or you could have some sort of reconciliation where the two sides kind of compromise. I mean, for example, any of you who may be familiar with religion in Mexico, not in Mexico City, but out in the rural areas of Mexico, know that there's traditionally been a mixture of the native religions, the pre-Christian and Catholicism. Places, the Hindus and so forth had a tendency to do this, and even in Christianity, I mean, we managed to attach Jesus's birthday to an existing winter solstice holiday, and draw people in that way into Christianity. So there's a certain amount of compromise. There's another form of reconciliation which is somewhat different, and that is that the two sides can be painted as being actually equivalent and just saying the same thing in different ways. There are folks around like Deepak Chopra who will try to tell you that, you know, the Buddhists really invented quantum mechanics 2,000 years ago and science is just catching up. Personally, I break out in hives when I read stuff like that, but that is another thing that happens. So this warfare can be resolved. It can go on forever. It can be reconciled. Or there's a fourth possibility that's really kind of interesting, and that was suggested by the great evolutionary scientist Stephen Jay Gould. He referred to this by the rather lofty title of NOMA, which stood for non-overlapping magisteria, rather hoity-toity term, but what he means is that the confrontation, in particular between religion and science, is not fundamental. The problem is that each side has its own proper turf and they keep invading each other's turf. In particular, up to the point where science can answer some question that's properly within its own turf, religion has tended in the past to come in and say, well, okay, here's the way the universe works. The sun goes around the earth. Here's where it all came from. Here's how old it is. All of these scientific questions get answered by religion. And so religion is constantly fighting a sort of rear guard action to defend that turf that isn't rightfully its. But if in fact you can delineate the turf of religion and science appropriately, then there's no overlap and there's no conflict and the problem just goes away. Okay, so looking at this conflict of belief systems this way, those are sort of the possible outcomes. What I want to propose is another way to look at this notion of the encounters between belief systems. And in particular, why what I've just been talking about is not a good way to look at the relationship between science and Zen. I mean, science and Zen, it just doesn't feel to me like there's a battle going on. So, like I said at the beginning, I mean, this is all started to sound a little dry and theoretical, I guess. And I just want to say again, I care passionately about this question. I care very deeply about Zen. I care very deeply about science. And I want them to get along. I mean, it's sort of like having two kids whom you love more than anything. They each have their own separate lives, but wherever their lives overlap, you really want them to get along. You want harmony instead of conflict. The last thing you want to do is choose one over the other because you love them both, each for who they are. But it's also unreasonable to just try to separate them like Gould does, to force them to be completely separate and lead separate lives so they don't interact and there can't be any discord. And really, at its deepest, the reason for that is that because when there's harmony in the family, there's more than just a lack of discord. There's a sort of synergy that goes on that makes the whole greater than just the sum of its parts. And that's the kind of feeling that I'm trying to convey about Zen and science. It's the way I'd like to feel about Zen and science. Is there a better way to view the situation? So there are many belief systems that really do match the description I gave before, you know, the dogmatic, self-defensive, you know, ex cathedra pronouncements and all that. But I claim neither science nor Zen really fit that description. And if that's true, then we shouldn't assume that the encounter between them has to follow this historical confrontational pattern of basically philosophical warfare. So why do I say that science and Zen don't fit those elements of that description I was giving about belief systems, right? So I said, well, first and foremost, a belief system is a collection of authoritative answers to big questions, but science and Zen aren't like that. Each of them is first and foremost a method or a practice. It's something to do rather than just something to believe in blindly. And the second thing I was saying about belief systems is that those authoritative answers are delivered by special authorities, the priest sacred texts. But both in science and in Zen, there really isn't a secret privileged, you know, we do have priests, but they're not magic. They may know more and help each person learn for themselves, but they don't have some sort of magical access to the truth. And the third thing about the belief system is it's to be taken on faith without question. You know, there's that line in the wonderful old Christian hymn, drive the dark of doubt away. But in science, everything is always tentative. It's always subject to revision or change or even to be discarded. And the same is true in Zen. We say, small doubt, small enlightenment. Great doubt, great enlightenment. So doubt and skepticism are encouraged. And things are not supposed to be just taken on faith as dogma. And then finally, in these other belief systems, first you start with these beliefs, you take them and accept them on faith, and then they tell you what action to take. But in science and Zen, as I said, you start with the practice, and any beliefs that flow from that, from your practice, those are follow-on side effects. They may be very good, they may be important, but they're not primary. And finally, those belief systems I was talking about before sustain themselves and reject all others. But we know that's not true of Zen and science. I mean, Zen, you constantly hear various folks, including Suzuki Roshi, talk about how you can be a Christian or a Jew and practice Zen meditation. In fact, there was a wonderful speaker we had at the Old Canada, Alan Liu, who went by the sort of social nickname of the Zen rabbi, who was, you know, he was very Jewish and he was very Zen, and he gave a great talk to us at the Old Canada that was based on that sort of fusion. And coming from the other direction, one of my favorites on the science side of this this whole interaction is Sam Harris. He's a neuroscientist who wrote a book called Waking Up. And he's very much in opposition to religions as dogmatic belief systems, but he's very open to non-dogmatic forms of spirituality like Zen. And in fact, he spent years in Asia studying Buddhism. So if this is a better description of both Zen and science, what can we expect the encounter between them to look like? Well, as I said before, one thing you might say is, well, science and Zen really are just two different ways of saying the same thing. They use different vocabularies, but they're the same thing. That's what Deepak Chopra would tell. I don't really believe that. I believe they really are different. Science and Zen are different. So what is the fundamental difference between science and Zen? Well, I would suggest that it's that science starts with a strictly objective view of the world, and Zen starts with a purely subjective view of the world. Now, what does that really mean? What do I mean by objective and subjective? I mean, we often now use those terms and hear them used in the sense that objective means that's an actual true fact, and subjective means, oh, that's just a fuzzy personal opinion. But this really is a grave injustice to the word subjective. The original literal meaning of subjective is that which is placed under. In other words, that which is foundational. There's an interesting thing that Carl Jung said about this. He said, one who looks outward dreams, one who looks inward awakens. So when I say that Zen is based on a subjective view, I don't in any way mean to suggest a merely subjective view or just a subjective view. I mean, the subjective view is very important. So what exactly is the subjective view? What's the foundation of that? Where does it come from? Well, the objective view is based on a strict separation of subject and object, okay, of the observer and the thing observed. There's distance between the two. The subjective view is based on the intimate unity of the subject and the object. Those are two fundamentally different ways of viewing things. Now, it might seem kind of strange for science to take the subjective view that intentionally puts distance between the observer and the thing being observed. I mean, why not? Don't you want to get up close and personal, get a closer look to get a good understanding of what it is you're studying? But one thing to observe is that distance can give a perspective that really clarifies. It's a response to the old adage, you can't see the forest for the trees. For example, think of aerial photography, where backing off to an airplane or even to a satellite can give a much better perspective than what you get by just wandering around on the surface of the Earth. Think of that iconic photo, in fact, of the whole Earth as seen from the moon and how that gives a new perspective. So that distance can be important. By taking this objective view, by separating the subject and the object, science seeks something very important. It seeks a perspective that's not dependent on the observer and is therefore the same for everyone. This really relates back to that question of taking things on faith from a privileged priesthood. In theory, any person is capable of practicing the scientific method and should reach the same conclusions as a world expert. Now, of course, in practice, almost all of what one knows about science does in fact come from the experts and their writings, but that's just a practical limitation. It's not fundamental. It's not just purely theoretical either. I mean, let me give a personal example. We all know that molecules and atoms and subatomic particles are inconceivably small. It's just about impossible to wrap our brains around this. We try to get a hold of it by using images like, there are more water molecules in a glass of water than there are glasses of water in the Pacific Ocean. I mean, that's literally true. And yet, can you really wrap your head around that? So, ironically, as physicists try to investigate smaller and smaller particles, they need more and more energy, which means bigger and bigger machines. So physicists create giant machines at enormous cost to study tiny particles and determine their properties. The latest proposed particle accelerator, is literally the size of Switzerland. But over 100 years ago, there was a great physicist named Robert Millikan, who was a very clever fellow, and he devised a benchtop experiment capable of measuring the electric charge on a single electron. In freshman physics lab at Caltech, they had us replicate that experiment. So I can say that I have personally determined the charge on the electron. I don't need to just look it up and take it on faith. I found the answer for myself. That made a profound impression on me, which of course is why our professors had us do it. And you can sort of see an analogy there with the way that a Zen teacher is one who really helps you find the truth for yourself. Doesn't just give you the truth wrapped up in a nice package with a bow. If you open that package, what you find inside is the question that you should have been asking and encouragement to find the answer for yourself. Okay, so this makes objectivity, the objective view, sound pretty good. If objectivity is so wonderful, why not just declare it the winner and relegate subjectivity back to a secondary role? Well, one answer to that is that if we want to follow Jung's advice and look inward and awaken, we have a kind of a problem. In that situation, there is no separation between the observer and the observed. Objective self-knowledge would seem to be an impossible contradiction. And in fact, logicians have grappled with the limitations of logical thinking, and typically the fly in the ointment that causes those limitations is self-referential paradoxes, like the mind trying to think about itself. Yet in Zen, this intimacy of the mind with itself isn't seen as an obstacle. It's the key to our meditation practice. The lack of objective self-knowledge is just the flip side of the possibility of subjective self-awareness. Maybe this relates to what Master Dijong said to his student Fayan: not knowing is the most intimate. It's also true that for all of its power, the objective view of science is somewhat idealized. It's something of an abstraction, because in practice, a scientist observes the presumed external reality indirectly via complex instruments and human senses and assorted mental processes. On closer examination, our perception of reality is not quite the solid thing that we might think it was. Professor Andy Clark puts it very succinctly: perception itself is a kind of controlled hallucination. But there is one thing to which we have direct, immediate access, and that's the workings of our own mind, the experience of our consciousness. And if we regard this direct access as our starting point in understanding the rest of the universe, then we start to approach the subjective view of Zen. Again, as Jung said, one who looks inward awakens. So given these two practices, Zen practice and the scientific method, how should we think about the encounter between them? Rather than seeing this as the kind of win-lose confrontation that I described earlier, perhaps consider ideas like those expressed by, well, some familiar voices like Emerson, who said, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds." F. Scott Fitzgerald extolled the ability to hold two opposed ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. Walt Whitman famously said, "Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes." This kind of thinking suggests the possibility of an encounter between science and Zen that's not only peaceful, but fruitful. Unlike Gould's Noma, it doesn't try to disallow overlap between science and Zen. It doesn't try to keep them apart like two children who can't get along. Instead, it sees an opportunity for synergy. Let me illustrate what I'm talking about with an analogy, okay? I want to use the analogy of the human visual system. Like all mammals, We have two eyes. Why? Why is this advantageous? Well, of course, one obvious answer is, well, okay, we got two eyes, so one's a spare in case the other one gets damaged or disabled permanently or temporarily. Yeah, okay. But there's something else that happens. One thing is that to the extent that the two eyes are seeing non-overlapping images, we have a wider field of view. You can see almost all the way around it. But there's something entirely new when the images of the two eyes overlap. We get depth perception. So the area of overlap produces two related but somewhat different images of the same scene. Neither image is better than the other. Either one could be used alone. But by combining them where they overlap, something entirely new is created, the experience of depth perception. Now, the overlap of science and Zen is partial. It's far from complete. I mean, I don't expect to learn a lot of physics from meditation, and I don't expect to realize compassion by practicing the scientific method. But there are areas where they overlap, and in those areas, I suggest that it provides an opportunity for synergy. If you think of these two viewpoints as being wrapped around each other like the black and white figures in the classic yin-yang diagram, what we're seeking is not to throw one of them away or to mix the two together to yield a bland uniform gray. The synergy provides something new, analogous to depth perception from stereo vision. I first encountered this idea in a book by Konrad Lorenz called Behind the Mirror. And it really has stuck with me ever since. As one example of this synergy, I would point to a very big issue that both Zen and science address, but come to totally different conclusions. And this is just one example. So science, in the form of, say, neurophysiology and brain science and evolutionary psychology, clearly regards consciousness as an emergent property of the physical universe. And Zen, at least to the extent that it retains its original inheritance from its Buddhist roots, it inherits the long-standing idea from India that the physical universe is ultimately an emergent phenomenon of consciousness, that there's universal consciousness and that manifests itself as the physical universe. Now, these look like ideas that are just butting heads in strong conflict. I mean, the idea that the physical universe arises from consciousness might seem absurd from a scientific viewpoint. Again, back in Berkeley, back in the Berkeley days, I went to a talk by Swami Satchidananda, who was a real serious Hindu holy man. And he talked about this idea that reality really emerges from universal consciousness. And I remember hearing this at the time and thinking, mumbo jumbo alert, uh-oh. But if you consider that we experience directly, not absolute reality, but rather what I referred to before from Professor Clark, that controlled hallucination that our brain creates from our senses, that's really the world that we inhabit, then in fact, the world we actually live in does arise from our consciousness. When I was at Berkeley, John Searle was a very senior professor in the philosophy department. And one of my favorite quotes from him is, human consciousness is both a physical emergent property and a separate subjective reality. Don't choose one or the other. Choose them both and watch for the synergy between them. So much like depth perception through stereo vision, something in our minds allows for this kind of synergy between science and Zen, combining the 2 points of view in a way that creates something truly new. And I think this idea of stereo vision as a metaphor for thought is deeper than it might seem at first. I mean, human thinking is largely visual. You know, you look at how much of our brain is taken up by the visual cortex. We have these figures of speech that betray this in our language. I see what you mean. Look at it this way. Can't you visualize the answer? And so Just as the visual cortex is a large part of our brain, a correspondingly large part of our thought processes is really visual. When you silence the monologue in your head through meditation practice, you get a clearer experience of the extent to which our minds really are primarily visual and intuitive rather than primarily verbal. So what's the bottom line? What is this harmonious relationship of Zen and science? It's between the objective view of science, which is based on separation and difference, and the subjective view of Zen, which is based on unity and equality. It's a harmony between the objective view based on difference and the subjective view based on equality. In other words, the relationship of science and Zen can best be seen as the harmony of difference and equality. Does anyone have a question?
May?
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for, this is one of the most fascinating topic in my life as well. I love to hear everything you talk. But I think we're in this extraordinary moment right now. And I think so much about this. What does the virus come from? So thank you for in the end about harmony of difference and equality. And then we see the light, we see the dark, and there's light in the dark, there's dark in the light right now. So do you mind to talk about this virus from Zen perspective and also from science perspective? And then I heard you just mention, according to Zen, this physical existence is actually the manifestation of our consciousness. Okay, and then so it's really interesting that they basically who generated this virus. It's us, right? I mean, I don't know. Is our human conscious generate this virus? Is that true or not? I mean, just love to hear, because this is such an extraordinary time about this subject. They're so powerful. I mean, even I think if I'm a scientist to study this virus, it must be fascinating. I mean, at this moment, but in the meantime, there's just so many people died, and then yeah, I was just speechless when I think about this virus. So I'd love to hear anything talk.
Well, I would say that the experience that we all have of the virus, that is the world that we live in as the world that we perceive, is quite clearly something that we create for ourselves, just if for no other reason than that there are so many different people who see this situation so differently. I wouldn't in any sense say that, oh, if we just didn't create the virus in our minds, the whole thing would go away. I think that would be, that's almost the worst thing you can do, in the sense that denial of the existence and seriousness of the pandemic has been one of the reasons why so many people have been taken ill and have died. But the virus, like anything else, we have to both study scientifically, and we have to realize that the way that we're relating to it is based on the way that our consciousness constructs an awareness of it, based on the indirect knowledge that we've gotten from whatever sources we pay attention to. And one of the big problems these days, of course, is that different people are paying attention to completely different sources and coming up with completely different models in their world, their inhabited world, of what's actually going on. hope that sort of addresses your question.
Yeah, that's the scientific part. How about the Zen part?
Well, that's what I was getting at about the way that we experience the virus in the world that we actually live in, as opposed to some abstract, absolute reality that's outside of ourselves. But again, I mean, the idea that, you know, that our consciousness creates the reality that we live in doesn't mean that we can sort of arbitrarily eliminate something like the virus just by wishing it away. Obviously, that's not true.
Yeah. Thank you.
David, thank you from another 1967 vintage engineer. And I was really glad that you ended on the harmony of difference and equality. And I, pardon the bad paraphrase, it begins, the great way is not difficult for those who have no preference, but let the slightest distinction occur and heaven and hell are forever separated, or something like that. When I first heard that at Conando, I said, boy, this is fertile ground to study engineering and spirituality. And I wondered if you had experience of the jumping back and forth or trying to straddle that great chasm, the dilemma of allowing the slightest distinction.
Yes, certainly. And I guess the way that I've always looked at ideas like the harmony of difference and equality, I mean, is everything just all one big undifferentiated blob? No, that's clearly not true. Is the universe really just a collection of totally fragmented independent things? Well, no, that's not true either. The image that has always seemed meaningful to me is, you know, in the ancient civilizations in the Middle East, they had these walls that were carved with what's called bas-relief, which is basically all these, you know, they have chariots and horses and warriors and so forth carved in the surface of the wall. And they'd be carved very deeply. I mean, they would be like statues that were sort of embedded in the wall. And if you look at one of those things, saying that it's a bunch of a collection of separate statues isn't really right. But saying that it's just a wall isn't really right either. It's both at the same time. And that I don't know if that image is very meaningful for anybody else, but for me, that notion has always helped me to understand and relate to the idea of the harmony of difference and equality. It's many things and it's one thing all at the same time. Ideas are not in conflict.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Dave, I have a question. I actually have many questions I want to ask you, but I'll try to pick the top ones. So as you were talking, I was thinking about how actually, you know, historically, spirituality and science were together. Astronomy and astrology were the same thing. Math and numerology were studied together. And then the Western world kind of took parts and separated it. So I just thought that was interesting, like how we're now trying to put it together and make spirituality compatible with science. I think that the main conflict, why spirituality or religion and science have so much conflict, is because there's incentive for them to have conflict. Almost always when religions are conflicting with science or religions are conflicting with each other. There's a political agenda underneath.
Yes.
And so the one example that came to me as you were talking is that, you know, doctors who followed the scientific method could be burned at the stake for being honest about their medical results. You know, you could be killed for healing someone. You could be killed for sharing wisdom at some points and places. And a lot of that was because, you know, the church wanted political power and they wanted a monopoly on the health industry. And so there's always that incentive, right? Like the root cause of it is human greed and human selfishness that causes the conflict. Often it's under the guise of a religion. It doesn't really have anything to do with the true religion or the true believers of that religion. So I guess my question for you is like, how do we solve that? And then the other question I had is, where do the arts fit in this? Because you've talked about science and religion, but we have things like dance, music, theater. Well, they're kind of science, they're kind of spiritual, but they don't belong to any religion. So those are my two questions. Like, what do we do about politics? And then where do arts fit in?
Well, yeah, I touched very briefly on the whole idea that the confrontation between belief systems tends to get tangled up with things like politics and tribalism. I certainly didn't give that anything near the kind of depth that it deserves, but there isn't really time, you know, to really plumb that. But I think we certainly have to confront the fact. I mean, certainly science tells us that we are highly evolved political and tribal social mammals. And, you know, that one of the things that happens is that conflict between the tribes turns into the glue that holds the tribes together. And oftentimes the only time that two previously hostile tribes can get together is if they have to join forces to protect themselves from a third tribe that's hostile. So this starts to sound a little bit like social Darwinism, and it always seems to me like it's a really bad idea to shy away from the idea that there are certain things that evolution has wired into us from, you know, 100,000 generations of critters that lived in an entirely different situation than we do. Those things are wired into us. And that doesn't mean that we should put them on a pedestal and elevate them in the sense of classic social Darwinism. But we better not deny them. We better acknowledge their reality, because we're never going to be able to deal with those things, with those wired in prejudices and you know, that tribalism and the kind of proactive aggression that seems to be wired into us by evolution. We're never going to be able to deal with it if we don't acknowledge its reality. And I think if we really could look at ourselves in the mirror and not, you know, say human nature, devil or angel, check one box, but really delve into both the dark and the light sides of what goes on with us and figure out how they fit together, I think we'd be much better served. And your second question, I'm sorry, remind me.
It was about where the arts fit in. I was just thinking about your first
Oh, yeah.
response. I was just thinking, so all we need is an alien invasion and then all of humanity will bond together. But yeah, the next question was about the arts and where do they fit in? Because you talked about the war between science and religion, and wondering where the arts fit into the picture.
Well, my own view of the arts, and I mean, I'm not an artist and I didn't study art history in college, so this may be a naive way of saying it, but it seems to me that an artistic endeavor is a special kind of skillful means that allows you to use everyday actions or materials, you know, wood or stone or plaster or dance or singing, to express a deeper truth that can't be expressed logically and verbally. That's fundamentally what art is not just about amusing people and creating beauty. It's about accessing a deeper truth.
Mhm.
And I said once, and for better or worse, it got captured on the video that's on the website right now, that one way of looking at Zen is that it itself is an art form in which the medium that you express a deeper truth is your everyday life. If you can make your everyday life be an ongoing expression of your true nature, then your life itself becomes an art form because it's expressing something that's beyond words, a deeper truth.
That's really beautiful. Thank you. Nick.
Dave, thank you for your talk. I really appreciate how you delineated the nuances of what a belief system is and what all that entails. And my question is, since we are Zen Buddhists and we are the most current living descendants of Shakyamuni Buddha, what would you say Shakyamuni Buddha taught us to believe?
Well, I would say that he taught us to believe that our fundamental nature is not what we would normally think of as our everyday identity. And that in fact, there's a lot about our everyday identity that obscures our true nature. And that fundamentally our practice is to eliminate that obscuring overlay so that our true nature can be realized in our lives. There was an interesting analogy that was made. I don't know, I don't recall who made it. I believe it was a Japanese Zen teacher, but I'm not sure. He said that when you go to a movie theater, you see previews, and one after another, these previews come up, and you keep waiting for the main feature. But it just keeps being more and more previews, and you even keep noticing, hey, I think I've even seen this preview before, and it just goes on and on like that. You're trying to figure out where's the true feature here? Where's the true nature of this? And really, your true nature is not one or the other of the various things that you do at different times in different situations, any more than the previews are the real essence of watching a film. The real essence of that experience, the true nature, is like the screen. It's the sort of stage on which all the rest of this is being played out. And when you can see through all the obscuring details of your small self and realize your true self in your life, I think that's the lesson that we got from Shakyamuni.
Thank you, Dave.
Dawn and then Lee.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dave, for your talk. What I got out of what Buddha was teaching us was to be liberated from belief. And I think he even said so, don't believe me and don't believe the scriptures, and find out for yourself. And so that, belief, if I close my hand and tell you I have a precious jewel in my hand, I'm holding a precious jewel, you have to believe it. Then you have to believe I do or I don't. And until I open my hand, and the moment I open my hand, it's no longer a matter of belief. You know it. It's I think this thing of belief is a very interesting thing, and it seems that, to me anyway, that Buddha was giving us a method, a practice to actually free ourselves from the limitations of belief. And in my experience in interacting with people about why they have beliefs, it seems that I caught myself doing this, believing in something as a kind of a shield against experiencing reality. And that's why people fight over beliefs, I think, because it is a form of protection, something that you don't easily want to give up. So, I don't, I think beliefs have an agenda for most people, and that I think our practice is to free ourselves from the limitations of our beliefs. That's just what occurs to me, and it seems like that's why Buddha didn't have any theories about the origin of the cosmos, or he wouldn't engage in those things. What happens to you after you die? These questions are all assumed that there's a you to even die. They're based on a belief. The questions are born of a belief that, not knowledge. And so anyway, that's just my 3.5 cents on the deal. I don't know what you think about that, but anyway, thanks.
Yeah, I would say it's not just a question of belief or no belief, but rather a question of where belief fits into the larger structure of your practice. And for me, the most important part is that you don't start from the beliefs. You don't start with this package of beliefs. Here, take it or leave it, right? And then proceed from there to live your life. You start your practice, and if there are beliefs and understandings and realizations that come from that, that's fine. That's great. Okay. And you take those things, and you don't have to say, oh my God, it's a belief. It arose from my practice, but it's a belief. I can't have this, and throw it away. But you also don't want to cling to it so hard that your knuckles start to bleed. Those beliefs can be held gently in the palm of your hand for as long as they continue to arise from your practice, whether it's the practice of meditation or the practice of the scientific method. And at the point where those beliefs no longer match what you're finding in your practice, they can be lightly discarded. It's when your beliefs take you prisoner that they really become a problem. I think one of the things, in fact, that marks most people's relationship to their belief systems is that they look at every belief as having two little check boxes after it. One is checked true and the other is checked false. And they're just desperate to check one or the other. I absolutely believe this. I absolutely don't believe this. And I'm going to believe it going forward. You hear people of faith saying, I believe in da 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 da, and there's absolutely no way you can change my mind. That's the strength of my faith. They view that as a virtue. I don't. Okay. And certainly that's the last thing that any scientist ought to be doing. Everything in science, there's this widely held misconception that the whole idea of science is that you come up with a theory and then you do experiments to prove it. And when you've proved your theory correct, then it's a fact, it's a law. And that's not the way science works at all. Science never proves anything. It's not even trying, right? Every scientific belief has some level of plausibility or credibility attached to it. And different people can attach different values, but a consensus arises as to, how good are Newton's laws of gravitation? They look pretty good till Einstein came along. They still look pretty good in most situations. But it's when you sort of get nailed to your beliefs and can't move anymore. That's the kiss of death in science. And I think it's the kiss of death in Zen too.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the beliefs are, things that I don't know how exactly. I think they're limited, and we all start with them. I mean, I came to Zen with a whole bunch of beliefs, ideas, and all that, and little by little, those things went away, and yeah. Anyway, thank you.
We have Lee and then Teresa.
Thanks, Dave. Very interesting topic and a very good talk. I really enjoyed it. And I couldn't help but think of one of those scientific experiments that made such a big impression on me were the experiments that were done to explore the wave particle theories. And what they found a couple of really interesting things from that. One of which is that the electrons or the particles that they were studying are both waves and particles. They are both something and they're a wave. And the other thing that they discovered, which is even more interesting, was that the people doing the experiment were part of the experiment and had an effect on the outcomes. Mm-hmm. So to me, that is the point at which the Zen view and the scientific view completely converge, because you then realize that when you are working with the world, you are part of what is working. That sense of interconnectedness that Zen speaks of just comes out, or becomes clear right in that moment. So I just kind of wanted to share that with everybody as a kind of a part of what you were talking about. So.
Yes, thank you, Lee. Yeah, this conundrum that you're talking about, where the experimenter is actually part of the experiment, and the particle assumes a distinct position at the point where it's observed and the wave function collapses. I mean, the quantum mechanics is very strange. And you may have heard, I can't remember, I think it was Max Born who said, if you don't think quantum mechanics is weird, you don't understand quantum mechanics. It's the particular thing that you're discussing, you probably know, goes under the rubric of the Copenhagen interpretation. That is that it is actually the act of observing the wave function that causes it to collapse and the particle to yield a distinct location. And I've tried very hard over the years to understand quantum mechanics, and I still don't really understand it. So I don't know quite what significance to put on the similarity between that and the idea that the physical universe arises from consciousness. Maybe my brain is too small to understand that, but it's not for lack of trying.
It does indicate a point where science and well, how would you put it? It's a point where things converge, where reality and consciousness converge. It's one of those points where, yes, we have to realize that we are not objective observers in this experiment. We are part of the experiment. So that convergence is something I think that Zen is speaking of in so many ways.
I'm sorry, Lee, your audio just cut out at the very end there.
I think that that convergence of being, looking at, having consciousness of the world and being part of the world, this is something that I think Zen understands and Zen can express.
Yes. There's definitely something going on there. There's a wonderful line in one of T.S. Eliot's poems where he says, "The flowers have the look of flowers that are looked at."
Good quote. Okay.
Anyone else?
Teresa?
Hi, Dave. Thank you for your talk. As you were talking, these two quotes by Suzuki Roshi came to my mind. One is they're kind of related. One is we exist as an idea in our mind. And the other one is moment after moment, we come out of nothingness, and that is the true joy of life. So I also thought about what Don just said about beliefs and making us safe. So I wonder if, beliefs help us to make us feel solid. Maybe we are somehow scared of not being solid. But I guess my question is, what do you think about these two quotes that I mentioned, and why do you think, related to the final, the way you ended your talk about the harmony of difference in equality, why it's my impression that as humans we stressed out a lot the part of difference. That's our experience of going through life feeling different. So why do you think is that? Feeling different or separated instead of feeling one with everything? Why do you think it's so difficult to experience that oneness? Thank you.
Well, I think there are a number of points of view that you can take in trying to look at that, Teresa. I mean, from the point of view of evolutionary psychology, you would presumably want to make a clear distinction between yourself and both the other people you deal with and the critters that want to eat you and the critters that you want to eat and so forth. And, spending too much time when you're out trying to hunt for dinner, thinking about the unity of yourself with all things isn't going to put dinner on the table. I mean, there was a wonderful phrase I heard. I went to another talk back in the Berkeley days. Ram Dass was giving a talk. I think he was still called Baba Ram Dass back then. And he talked about the phenomenon that he called going meta. And what he meant by that was that he had experienced people living together in groups where they would spontaneously get into these discussions about the nature of reality and the individual versus the unity of them all. And what they were really trying to do at that moment was supposedly figure out who's going to wash the dishes. And I mean, he was just kind of making the point that thinking about the unity of things, the equality is perhaps in some way a deeper truth than thinking about the differences. But we're not really trying to choose one or the other. what we're really looking for is that harmony of difference and equality, and being able to shift as appropriate between those two points of view, or hold them both in our mind at the same time. And there's some very interesting stuff. I don't want to dive too much into this rat hole, but there's a very interesting set of books that I was reading about the evolutionary psychology of religion. And it talks about why religious thinking seems to have evolved, and talks about which explanations make sense and which ones don't, and which ones hold up to experiment and so forth. And it's a fairly complicated business, but and frankly, it only goes a certain way toward explaining non-dogmatic spiritual viewpoints like Zen, but it does a pretty bang-up job of explaining rigid, dogmatic religious viewpoints. And if you really, there are a couple of them, Scott Atran and Pascal Boyer have written some very good books on this subject, and it's a very active area of. And this is hardcore evolutionary psychology, right? This is not just people writing books because they feel like it. These are serious experimentalists. And they talk about why it is that we take certain viewpoints on things in the world, and what the evolutionary selection pressures were that led to some of those things. I'm not sure if that's, maybe I'm getting all dry and dusty again here on you. Sorry.
Thank you. I just listened to a talk by Hoitsu Suzuki recently that he gave at San Francisco Zen Center through Zoom, obviously. Mm-hmm. And he said that every Sunday he lectures on the harmony of difference and equality. And I was like, wow, every Sunday he talks about that. So I guess there's a lot to be said about it. Thank you.
Well, I mentioned earlier that Alan Liu had given a talk at the Old Canon Do, and Huitsuki actually came and gave a talk once at the Old Canon Do. And there was one part of the talk that really stuck in my mind. He talked about the sort of canonical image that we sometimes talk about in Zen of the moon reflected in a still pond, where you look out over the pond on a still night and the whole moon is reflected in the still water. And he said, and then a breeze comes up and the surface of the pond breaks into 1,000 ripples that are all glittering with the light of the moon. He says, that's very beautiful too, isn't it?
Any last questions? Vanessa?
Dave, I really enjoyed all the aspects of your talk tonight. But one aspect that I particularly enjoyed was just hearing about your own personal journey from your heady days of studentship in Berkeley in the 60s to today. And, you mentioned coming across Zen flesh, Zen bones, and your yoga practice. And then finally finding Zen and starting to practice Zen like well over 30 years later. And I suppose my question is, what took you so long? In that sort of
I've never actually thought about that. I have asked myself that question so many times. The way that I got out of the mode, I was for years thinking of Zen as being something to think about, to read about, to study. It was fascinating, but there's just another one of those topics of discussion and thought and reading. And then Suzanne said, oh, look, I've seen this listing for this course at Stanford. it's going to be taught by this fellow Les Kay, who's apparently a real Zen teacher. And I thought, oh, great, a university course. I can go in and get reading assignments, and we can have classroom discussions, and I can write essays, and maybe there'll even be a final exam. Oh boy, just my thing. And so I went and I took Les's course at Stanford. And he had us start sitting a little bit at the end and encouraged us to sit at home. And I remember saying a couple of things to Les toward the end of that course. One was, I feel like for years I've had this beautiful vehicle sitting in my driveway, and all I did was sit in the house and read the instruction manual. And the other thing that I said was, I've been sitting Zazen like you suggested, and I'm going to be doing this for the rest of my life. And he just smiled at me and said, just do it today and see what happens. So that was the thing that really changed for me, changed Zen from being just something to read about to something to do. And I've been coming to Kannon-do ever since.
It sounds like the timing was just right.
Well, if you go 30 years, just right, yes. When I first gave a way-seeking mind talk many years ago, I remarked that, I was actually in Berkeley when Suzuki Roshi was still alive, still in San Francisco. And I could have gone over there and sat with Suzuki Roshi. And I said, sitting around and beating yourself up about not doing Zen earlier is about the most un-Zen-like thing you can do. So I'm not going to do that.
Any other questions? Well, thank you, Dave. This has been a really thoughtful talk and very interesting, and really appreciate it. Do we have any announcements tonight? Vanessa?
Yes, there's going to be a special New Year's sitting tomorrow evening for New Year's Eve. It's the same Zoom space as always, same Zoom link, but I'll probably send out a reminder tomorrow during the day. It's going to start at 10 p.m. and it's going to run until just after midnight. It's going to be led by Valerie Beer, who some of you have studied sewing with. And that's it. It's a special event just to mark the transition from one year into the other. So that'll start at 10 o'clock tomorrow.
Thanks, Vanessa. Any other announcements?
Bonnie, I have an addendum to Vanessa's New Year's announcement.
Mm-hmm.
So we're still going to have the 6:30 p.m. regular Thursday Zazen. There's a few of us who tune in from the East Coast, and it'll already be next year by the time we do our 10 p.m. sitting here. So for anyone who is not a night owl but still wants to sit, we will do the Zazen pre-game New Year's sit.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for reminding us of that. Any other announcements? All right, well, everyone have a happy new year, and hopefully we'll see you tomorrow. And if not, we'll see you in the new year. And thanks again, Dave, for really awesome talk. All right. Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year. Wonderful, wonderful meeting. Thank you very much.
See you all in 2021.
Good night.
Good night.
All right.